Welcome to the Behind the Shield podcast. As always, my name's James Gearing, and this week it is my absolute honor to welcome on the show former law enforcement officer Tom Morgan. Now, I have to say that this is one of the most pertinent episodes that I've recorded when it comes to the environment that we're experiencing at the moment in 2026. On April 13th, 1997, whilst on the job, Tom was shot in the face by Jason Samuel and almost died. Now, the journey of forgiveness that you will hear not only Tom but his wife Christy embark on is exactly what we need to hear today. And if this isn't a lesson and an inspiration to us all, then I don't know what is. Now, before we get to this incredible conversation, as I say every week, please just take a moment. Go to whichever app you listen to this on, subscribe to the show, leave feedback, and leave a rating. Every single 5-star rating truly does elevate this podcast, therefore making it easier for others to find. And this is a free library of over 1,200 episodes now. So all I ask in return is that you help share these incredible men and women's stories so I can get them to every single person on planet Earth who needs to hear them. So with that being said, I introduce to you Tom Morgan. Enjoy. Well, Tom, I want to start by saying two things. Firstly, thank you to our mutual friend, Anthony Marquez, for making this introduction. And secondly, I want to welcome you onto the Behind the Shield podcast today.
Thank you, James. I also want to thank Anthony, or Tony. He's a remarkable young man. And one of the reasons I wanted to come on and talk to you was because I got to watch Tony's podcast and kind of listen to a little bit more of his story, which I'd heard part of it, but certainly not as much as was covered in the podcast. And that was, I thought, very well done. And Tony is an exceptional young man.
Absolutely. Well, we'll get to how you guys met later in this conversation. Let's start at the very beginning, though. Firstly, where on planet Earth are we finding you today?
I'm in Bakersfield, California.
So with that being said, tell me where you were born and tell me a little bit about your family dynamic, what your parents did, how many siblings?
Sure. Well, I was born in 1957 in San Jose, California. I was the firstborn to Tom and Patricia Morgan. My father at the time, and until he finally retired, was a teacher. He taught art, drafting. He was also a wrestling coach for most of his career. My mother was a nurse, a registered nurse, who, worked in a variety of hospital settings, but towards the end of her career, she worked mainly in lockup mental health facilities. I've got a younger brother. He's the youngest of the four of us, and two sisters in the middle. Everyone's still alive and doing well. I lost my father last August at the age of 94 years old. He was surrounded with his family when he went, and it was good that we had him with us for as long as we did. My mother died about 20 years ago from lung cancer. She was a lifelong smoker.
With your mother's work, what were some of the things you remember her talking about with the mental health side, because I think a lot of people don't realize that even though we have progressed immensely when it comes to the mental health world and even what we describe as a disability these days. I mean, you have, people with cerebral palsy powerlifting. We have people with Down syndrome doing, Hawaiian Ironman triathlon. So we're redefining it incredibly, but there are still, men and women on the physical and the mental health side that are going to spend their entire life in some sort of ward.
Yeah, well, needless to say, she didn't talk a lot about like her interactions with patients, because that, of course, that stuff's confidential, and you could certainly see that the work took its toll on her. But one of the things that my kind of a wellness practice, before the phrase was popular, that my mother always engaged in was reading. And I think that's how she kind of escaped the rigors of, dealing with the criminally, mentally ill on a day-to-day basis. And that's, I inherited her love of reading, which, I credit, for whatever small amount of insider intelligence that I have, to the fact that I love to read. My mother was in that field during an interesting time in the United States, because that coincided with a movie that came out called One Flew Over the Cuckoo's Nest, which was actually filmed at the state institution where she worked in Salem, Oregon. That also, and I'm not exactly sure of the timing, but that all just generally coincided with the disenfranchisement of the mentally ill from lockup facilities. There was a time in this country when folks who were mentally ill that we couldn't treat or didn't know what to do with, that may have not been criminals, or involved in criminal activity. We just, they were disabled to the point that they couldn't care for themselves. There was a time when those people were all housed in these massive state facilities throughout the land. And I think it was when Reagan was president, there was legislation, and a lot of those people were released from mental health facilities out into the street. And I don't know enough about it to know whether or not there's some sort of strict cause and effect with, a lot of the problems we have today with the mentally ill and unhoused folks. But, they certainly had to go somewhere, and they weren't going into, institutions or any kind of care. So I think a lot of those people were kind of left, as kind of the detritus of society. They were, out of sight, out of mind. However, anymore, they're not so much out of sight, I guess.
I've had quite a few people that are, experts in, the unhoused space, as it were, and many of them, and many people in the mental health field as well, have said yes, that kind of Reagan decision to, remove these facilities really was the kind of beginning of the homelessness that we see today. And obviously, it's not the only thing, but I think it's pretty well acknowledged that a lot of people that are unhoused, are suffering from mental health challenges.
Yeah, that's certainly the case. And that was certainly the case, when I was a paramedic and when I was a cop, those are our day in, day out customers. Always, it was part of the texture of our careers were our interactions with these folks.
What about sports and exercise when you were in school age? Were you wrestling? Was your dad teaching you, or were there other things that you were doing?
Well, we couldn't help but, do some wrestling, just because that was always, my dad's love. But my dad was happy as long as we were involved in anything physical. He didn't, pressure us to become wrestlers. And frankly, I was a lousy wrestler. I was long and gangly, and I didn't have that kind of low to the ground type of stature that, a good, strong wrestler, can take advantage of. But so I kind of, headed in other directions. I got a motorcycle when I was, pretty much old enough to ride it, and I raced motocross for a number of years. I played tennis in high school. I think I was on the football team for 1 year in junior high. And I was on track for several years, in a variety of events. But I was never what you would call a standout athlete. I just, it was just part of our lifestyle to be active and, be physical. So I think it's something I've always, however little I may have excelled in a variety of the things I got involved with, I still enjoyed doing it.
I think that's a really important perspective, though. Sadly, in modern society, predominantly because there's so much money attached to it, this elitism in a specific sport has become the holy grail. And that's moved us away from just playing sports because we enjoy it. We know that the multi-sport athlete mentally and physically is far more resilient than the specialist. But there's almost this kind of conversation that if you don't come first every time, then you're not worth a damn, rather than going back to what was always the case until recently, which is if you love playing sport, go play some sports. Just have fun. It doesn't matter if you're trying to win, of course, but the result isn't the point. It's the community. It's the shared suffering. It's the discomfort. It's the, the sharing the joy when you win and the commiserations when you lose. Those are all part of the whole thing. And it's a shame that we've got away from that.
Yeah, it's, and I know a lot of this has to do with the advent of the cell phone and, kids spending so much time in video games and on their cell phones. I mean, my mother used to refer to us as feral children, because she'd like open the door in the morning, or we'd, sneak out, and we wouldn't come back, until, it was dark, and we'd come back dirty and bruised and bloodied and, covered with horsehair and cuts and scrapes from blackberry bushes and crashing on our bikes. And I remember my upbringing was mostly outdoors, when I was, a kid and when I was growing up. And that was, that was encouraged. And now that I think back on it, I don't remember it being so much encouraged as that was just, what we did, and the out of doors was just full of so much wonder. And I loved exploring. When we moved to Oregon, my dad bought a 5-acre plot in the middle of the woods and built, he built from the ground up, literally, the home that we lived in. And I can remember the hours and hours spent exploring that 5 acres and the surrounding, thousands of acres of watershed that we lived in the middle of. And it was just a magical and fascinating upbringing.
I grew up on a farm. My dad was a veterinary surgeon, so I had very similar thing. I've used the term feral very often. Like, we were Lord of the Flies during the day and then, came back to the bed at night. What about career aspirations? What were you dreaming of becoming when you were still in school? Was it law enforcement or was it something else?
That's a weird thing for me anyway, because I never had like something I wanted to be ever since I can remember. Thinking about careers, the idea of having a career and being responsible is always a little bit frightening for me. The idea that I might someday have to, take care of myself or other people was completely foreign. I honestly dreaded the day that I was going to graduate from high school because I really had no idea what I was going to do. I mean, my parents, they told me they would, help us through college, and but they ended up getting divorced about the time I got um, ready to graduate. And so I was, um, they weren't in any position to help me go through college. And frankly, I was sort of surprised given my, lack of attendance my senior year in high school. I was surprised they even gave me a high school diploma. Uh, I think that they just accidentally, I think, left it in the pile, when they passed them out. I didn't go to my graduation ceremony. Uh, I, you know, they mailed it to me a few months later. I'd assumed I'd passed, but I did little or no actual coursework during that final year of high school. So that I'm sitting here in front of you now today is a miracle. I should have never accomplished much of anything if it was just based on my planning or anticipation of some sort of career after I got out of high school.
So walk me through that then. You graduate kinda-ish, maybe. You get this diploma in the mail. You're like, okay, well, I guess I did then. Where does that lead you initially?
Well, I had a buddy, I had a lot of friends and acquaintances at the time, from school. And he worked on the local ambulance. This was in Flagstaff, Arizona. And he used to come back, to the group after, a shift on the ambulance and regale us with all of the tales of, zooming all over town with lights and siren and going to traffic accidents. And, it sounded very exciting. And I thought, man, it's outdoors. You're kind of your own, you don't have a boss, standing over you telling you what to do. You make your own decisions, when, the decision needs to be made. And the excitement of it just really appealed to me. And I asked him what qualified it, how did he get into it? And he said, well, I went and took an EMT class. And so this was back in 76. And I took a community college EMT class, really the first academics I ever, spent any real time, studying and paying attention to, aside from just my love of reading. And I passed, got my EMT, and at the time my mother was working as a nurse in southern Inyo County Community Hospital, which is in Inyo County, which is between the White Mountains and the Sierras and the eastern side of California. It's just a beautiful, breathtakingly beautiful area, but very sparsely populated. Very small hospital. And she said, well, we've got this ambulance company up here that's always looking for people, a little private ambulance company that was based in a larger town to the south, but had a satellite station in Lone Pine. And she said, they'll, as long as you've got an EMT license, they'll hire you. And I said, well, I hitched a ride with a buddy of mine over to California and eventually found my way to Lone Pine. And, that was like 1976. I started working as an EMT on a little rural ambulance.
I just interviewed, again, a guy, Kevin Hazard, who's a paramedic and became an author. And he wrote an amazing book called American Sirens about the original paramedics and how that was actually out of a place called the Freedom House in Pittsburgh in the mid-60s. And they were all African-American men at that point. And it's interesting because we think of like the genesis of the medic program came from LA, Miami, in the 70s, but actually it's a decade prior. And as it gained popularity, they actually got rid of all the African-American medics in that program. So, it's a story most people haven't heard. I'm actually getting one of the original men on the show coming up. But that being said, so that's kind of the origin story that a lot of us didn't even realize. Talk to me about that world in the 70s, though. What was some of the career calls that you remember, and what was some of the technology you were working with back then?
Well, if it gives you any idea, one of the ambulances that I regularly ran out of was a converted hearse, because many ambulances, uh, I mean, pre-hospital care is a fairly recent concept. For many years, once they stopped just, throwing people in cars or buggies or, carriages to take them to the hospital, the next, ironically, most logical person or enterprise that took people to the hospital were the mortuaries, because their vehicles were kind of set up, to haul people laying down. And, they often, did dual duty. They'd take them to the hospital and then take them back to the, and have them involved. So I actually ran calls out of an old Plymouth and an old Cadillac ambulance that had the area for the first aid supplies was about the size of a large first aid kit. And it actually had recessed rollers in it that you could flip up to roll a casket into the back when needed, and flip the other way so you could roll the gurney in, if you had a patient. So we were, and while I was an EMT at the time in California, that wasn't required to work on an ambulance. There were actually rules at the time that allowed someone to work on an ambulance if they worked for a volunteer fire department with nothing more than an advanced first aid card, and that could actually be deferred if no one in the department had that requirement. And so we were actually surrounded by a number of smaller, up in Independence and Big Pine, volunteer fire department ambulances where the volunteer firefighters had virtually no first aid training. And they were like the original scoop and run. Somebody called an ambulance, they, hauled ass to the location, put them in the ambulance and drove as fast as they could to the hospital. And we were like one tier above that. The company I worked for required that you have your EMT certification, but often my drivers, didn't have EMT certification. They had advanced first aid. And when I say advanced first aid, I'm talking about the old classic Red Cross advanced first aid certification. And I did that for about 3 or 4 years working in that area. And that county didn't have any paramedics. When I first started as an EMT, the closest paramedics were in Mono County up by Mammoth. And the only reason we knew about them is because we were on the same radio system. And so we occasionally could hear them running calls up in the Mammoth area, near that ski resort. But to the south, the closest paramedics were in Los Angeles County and LA proper. And I don't think there were even any, the county to the south, where I'm at now, Kern County, I don't think they had paramedics until probably the late 70s, early 80s.
What were some of the notable calls you remember from that period of your career?
Well, the worst calls that we had were usually along 395, which at the time was a 2-lane stretch that ran from Los Angeles, Riverside, San Bernardino County up to Mammoth, which on the weekends was crowded with skiers going up and back from Los Angeles. And I know one of my first interactions with LA County firefighters was when we'd have a multi-car head-on traffic accident on the weekend, and suddenly I'm surrounded by 15 off-duty firefighters because they have, a great deal of time off and lots of toys, and they would often, be on their way up to Mammoth or on their way back. And they were always kind enough to stop and, give us instructions on how we needed to be treating our patients, which at the time I kind of resented. But, looking back on it, most of them had 20 times the training and experience that I had. But of course, I was the one that was going to have to ride to the hospital with them. As soon as we had them loaded up, they'd be back in their trucks and on their way back up to Mammoth. But we ran some just incredibly difficult, traffic collisions. And I think maybe it wasn't so much the calls that we ran, it was the fact that we lived in such a remote area. And if somebody was seriously injured, they ended up having to be transported down to usually Loma Linda in San Bernardino, and occasionally into Los Angeles to the Lancaster, Palmdale area. But so we'd have to, take a lot of times the critical patients that we picked up on the highway, we'd have to take them down, hundreds of miles, before they could get definitive care to larger, metropolitan area hospitals. And some of them didn't make it. I started with living patients in Long Pine sometimes that didn't make it to the hospital. And air transportation wasn't wasn't nearly as widely available as it is today. So a lot of those trips, ended up, being pretty long and stressful.
So so I'm understanding it right, because of the nature of the vehicle, you weren't able to actually attend to the patient. You're basically driving them to the hospital and then hoping that when you get there, they're still breathing.
Well, we could attend to them, but we just couldn't. There was no, our attendance was pretty limited.
Right.
I mean, if they had an IV, we could, adjust the drip, but we had no direct communications with any hospitals. We had basic first aid supplies in the ambulance. So, and we were the only ambulance in the area at the time. And so I can remember staying up for, 48, 72 hours running calls back to back. Because we were just the only, if we didn't come out to get people, then no one was going to come get them.
So how did that lead you to law enforcement?
Well, I eventually moved from Lone Pine to Ridgecrest, and for a while also in Mojave, California. And I mentioned earlier that we didn't have any paramedics the paramedic program had just started in Bakersfield when I moved down to Ridgecrest, south of Lone Pine. And there were no paramedics in the eastern side of Kern County. And Kern County is kind of, it's larger than a few states. It's one of the largest counties in the United States. I think third only behind Riverside and San Bernardino that are larger. So it's a massive county. And so the eastern portion had absolutely no advanced medical, pre-hospital care available at all. So I moved down to Ridgecrest and I helped start and establish the first paramedic program in the eastern Kern County area. And that program was right out of Squad 51, Johnny and Roy in emergency. We had one of those old orange core communication boxes to talk to the hospital. We had to call in, every time and give a patient assessment before we could get orders. And even when, working a code, that still had to all be, we had to send the strip, the EKG strip to the base hospital. It was literally it was the first paramedic program in that part of the county. And overall, my certification number for Kern County was 30. So I was the 30th medic ever certified in the county at the time I got certified. The first to work and transport people to the hospital in Ridgecrest. What got me into law enforcement was a recognition that I was unlikely to survive that job. It was, especially working in a private ambulance, the hours, the physical strain and stress on your body was constant. And back then, while fire departments worked, they're, a variety of on and off schedules. Working for a private ambulance company at that time, you pretty much worked all the time. So, I mean, even when I got over to Bakersfield, the only concession they made to that sort of thing in a large metropolitan area was we'd work 72 hours on and 72 hours off. And that was our schedule. That was period our schedule, as long as we were there. And, while a lot has improved over the years, at the time, it was taking a toll on me. My back was giving out. I think I'm a bit of a hypochondriac, and so seeing like many of the diseases my patients had or difficulties I would end up experiencing. And back during that period of time, hospitals weren't comfortable with people outside the hospital providing advanced pre-hospital care. And so we often got into confrontations and arguments with the doctors and nurses in the institutions that we transported people to because they didn't believe we had any business providing the medical care that we were providing. And so there was that constant tension, between us and the facilities, and the constant work and the lack of sleep. I just knew it was, going to eventually kill me. And I thought that law enforcement would be a reasonable alternative. It had a lot of the same attributes, that I liked about being a paramedic with a regular shift and the ability to advance. I didn't really see any attraction in, advancing within a private ambulance company and becoming, a manager or, a supervisor in that context. But I saw the hierarchy and chain of command in a law enforcement agency as an attractive way to, gain knowledge, experience, and promote up through the ranks as I did so.
It's so crazy that you're talking about 50 years ago, and yet the fire service as we speak now are basically working the same kind of hours. That we have on paper a 56-hour work week, but because of refusing to acknowledge exactly what you could have told the world 50 years ago, this is what it's doing to my mind, this is what's doing to my body, this is what's doing to my relationships, refusing to actually acknowledge that and turning their head. Now we have a massive recruitment and retention problem in the fire service. So what was supposed to be a 56-hour work week is now an 104-hour work week with the mandatory overtime. So, it's funny, people sometimes ask me, have you got studies, have you got data? I was like, well, apart from common sense, we are not supposed to be awake for 2, 3, 4 days straight. I mean, that's why they use that for torture and interrogation. It's the science is irrefutable on, how to optimize a human being as a paramedic or a police officer or a firefighter. And there's starting to be a conversation out of Florida, funnily enough, where it's starting to bloom here, where they're realizing if you take all the money that you're wasting with breaking your people and put it in the front, all of a sudden people want to work for you again. Imagine that. And you've got a healthier, happier fire service and paramedics and EMTs. But it's crazy listening to you talking about that, because what you're storytelling is something that you guys were figuring out 50 years ago, and yet people are still refusing to acknowledge with all the information and the internet and everything now, and the science and the proof and the people detailing how changing things has worked. And it's still like pulling teeth to get people to acknowledge that a human being cannot be worked for that many hours, especially sleep deprived under the high levels of stress that we're expected to work under?
Well, I think it's part of that is an endemic fault of the chain of command and the way public services, promote people. I guess I've given some thought to this, and it seems like, when you get the job, you become good at it, and which is, that's the most fun, the most interesting that you'll ever do in your career, is that direct hands-on firefighting, patient care, law enforcement, whatever. But then when they promote people, they don't necessarily, it's hard to promote people that had fun doing that, because they don't find administrative work to be anywhere near as attractive and fun. And so I think what you end up promoting is people that, maybe don't understand the job as well, but, have skill at testing and being administrators, but they never really held on to, or maybe never even really experienced that I don't know.
It's the service. It's the way I see it. Like actually doing it for the right reason.
Yeah. And so then you've got all of these people that love doing the job, that stay at it, that are good at it, but they never promote into positions where they can make decisions. Maybe it's that they don't spend enough time showing the good providers and workers the value of having their input into the system as they go up through the ranks. Because if there's ever criticism I've ever had, and I've probably had a lot of it, of the people I've worked for, is that they've forgotten where they came from. They don't appreciate the hardships that we suffered, in the street. And to your point, that seems exactly what's happening. It's those people that are actually making the decisions have forgotten that now, when their role at one time was fighting for their patients, now they need to fight for their teams, for the people that are actually doing the job, just as hard as they fought for their patients when they did the job on the street. Because it seems to me like, as you promote and go up through the ranks, it becomes more about how to get money, and how to check the boxes and make the spreadsheet look good, for your department, but not necessarily how to do the job, the hands-on job that you have to do, down, with line staff.
Yeah, it's fun. I mean, you're literally echoing what so many people are talking about to this day. And the irony is they're not even doing that well, because if you understand false economy, making something look good in a budget year isn't actually being fiscally responsible. Figuring out, well, what are the downstream costs of all these things, realizing that far outweighs the savings that you're presenting in that budget year, and then going, okay, well, we're bleeding money from, overtime, filling these spots, from training people who then leave our agency 2-3 years later, from the medical retirements and the line of duty death payments and the lawsuits from when we make mistakes because we're so exhausted. That's, just to give an example, the overtime budget for LAFD the last 4 years was $1.2 billion with a B dollars. So right there, we can't afford more fight. Yes, you can. There's your money. And that's just the overtime. That's not the lack of retention, all the other things I just talked about. So even from a budgetary point of view, they're doing a terrible job, because they're not actually fiscally responsible. They're not investing taxpayers' money wisely. It's being pissed down, down the street, basically. So this is what I'm realizing, is that, yeah, you can take promotional officer classes and have the pieces of paper, like you said, that allow you to scurry up a ladder. But if you don't have the moral courage and you don't understand actual leadership, what that means, especially servant leadership, then you're not actually fit for that position at all.
Yeah, there was a paradigm I noticed early in my law enforcement career that always confounded me, and that was you would see, as a new cop walking around, the hallways, I would see, veteran cops walking up to other veterans or, sergeants or lieutenants, and the first thing out of their mouth, almost, you could predict it when they started talking, is they would recite the number of years, months, days, hours, and seconds it was until their retirement. And I used to think, what the hell is going on here? Why? And these were all people that I looked up to, people when I was out in the street, when they were my FTOs, when they were my supervisors, I admired them. But I couldn't figure out why at a point in their career when people should be reveling in and taking advantage of everything they've learned and being proud of that all they can do is count the seconds until they can stop doing it. And that used to drive me crazy because it's like this cancer in the department, because, you gain experience, you get to a point where you're good at something, and you should take pride and joy in that ability. But instead, they're so disillusioned with the job that they're doing that they can't wait to leave it. And then when a young guy like me saw that, I was thinking, well, why am I doing this if that's how I'm going to end up? And one of the things for me was that I vowed to myself I wasn't going to be that person. I wasn't going to walk up and, say, hey, I can't wait to retire to every one of my friends. I wanted to be proud of what I did up until the point that I left it. And I wanted to regret leaving it because, or I wanted to get to a point where I would regret it if I had to leave early because I had more to do. I had more to teach. I had more to share with others. And I lament that, I don't see more of that in the services, that people, with years and years of service aren't held up as examples of things that, other younger people could be. Because, if you sit and talk to people with experience, on a day-to-day basis, and some of these people you talk to are, I have no doubt, extraordinary in the things they've, endured and learned. The lessons that they have for other people are just remarkable, and we just throw them away. We kind of use them up and crumple them up and toss them in the trash, and they know we're doing that to them, and they don't like it.
I think it's a two-pronged element. It's firstly, like you said, the environment. Are they investing in their people? Is it a healthy work week? Are they promoting people not just on pieces of paper but on merit as well? Are they taking care of themselves as they transition out into something else? Because I was talking to someone this morning, like there is no VA for first responders. I like the term disposable heroes because it's true. You walk out the door, don't let the door hit you on the ass, and good luck with all those physical and mental health ailments that you got. And that's not doom and gloom. That's just a reality, and I think it's something that we could work on. But then the other thing, which I thought was interesting, is that the time that we serve is dictated by a pension, not by your desire and when that finally fizzles out, whenever that is, the organic end of that particular chapter in your life. But no, this PERS or CalPERS or FRS says, well, you've got to stay here 25 years, and then you've got a 5-year drop. And it's like, well, does that align with when you're ready to go and do something else? No, it doesn't. So that's when you get these guys with the countdown apps. Between those two things, either A, they're in an environment that's just not nurturing them. And I'm not saying it's just the organization. Obviously, the person's got to have ownership as well. But if they're in a toxic environment that is now beating them down, and then they're chasing, a magic date on the calendar for a pension. That doesn't, that's not where you get excitement, performance, and it's not when, as you said, you don't get these excited people preaching to the next generation about how amazing it is to be a police officer or a firefighter. If the rhetoric, and I've talked about this a lot, is, well, you wait 10 years from now, you'll be on your third marriage and have an alcohol problem. That's not healthy rhetoric. It's not funny. I know we joke about it, but there's nothing funny about that at all. If you look at a lot of high performing teams around the world, whether it's in the military or ocean lifeguards or in business, they're focusing on their rest and recovery, their mental health, their physical standards, so they can optimize. But holding up, on the pedestal, the kind of broken, burnt out police officer or firefighter is a horrible recruitment tool, but it's a horrible way of even running an organization.
Yeah, I agree.
So you end up going into the law enforcement. Was it Bakersfield that you actually worked in specifically?
Yeah, while I was working as a paramedic, I became a reserve for a period of time, and then almost as soon as I finished my reserve training, I tested for full time, and back in January 23rd, 1984, I was hired full time with the Kern County Sheriff's Department.
So you mentioned obviously private ambulance company. It sounded like you were more rural. What was the change as far as the lens that you had now as a police officer, knowing somewhere like, Bakersfield has poorer areas, has gangs, has some, more desperate people in society now?
Well, like many, sheriff's departments, when you get hired, I don't know if it's still that way, but when I got hired on, you go through the academy, your basic academy. I went through field training. After I got out of field training, I was immediately transferred into the jail. So I worked corrections for probably 3 years before I, got back out on the street. So, of course, and that they do that, or they did that at the time, of course, because they needed to staff the jails, and no one with seniority, or few people with seniority wanted to work in the jails. And so it was kind of a convenient training ground, to kind of temper, the rookies, after they got out of the academy with, kind of a law enforcement environment, the chain of command. You're constantly exposed to, misdemeanor criminals and a few, hardened criminals, but it kind of teaches you to, how to deal with that element in a kind of controlled environment, which there's, arguments either way, but I found it valuable in preparing me for the streets when I did finally, get to transfer out. But pretty much all of my street law enforcement was, originally seen through that kind of institutional lens of the jails.
And what about when you actually ended up on the streets? Were there any kind of aha moments as far as some of the desperation that existed behind the facade of, modern American society?
No, not really. I mean, when you work as a paramedic, and I also worked in Bakersfield as a medic and a paramedic trainer for about probably 2 or 3 years. So I had experience in the area generally, where I was now a cop, and it was, I saw the same customers, just in a slightly different context. What started to happen at that point is a recognition that, whatever humanity that I'd, reservoir of humanity I'd managed to save up in my first, 25 plus years of life was slowly being eaten away by the job of law enforcement. When I was on an ambulance and working as a medic, they may not have been happy, but they were happy to see us. We were helping people directly and unequivocally. You know, nobody was ever nervous about paramedics showing up. No, nobody looks in the rear view mirror and sees an ambulance or a fire truck, just driving along and, suddenly starts, abiding by the vehicle code. It's a completely different dynamic for interacting with the public. And there's it's, I'm sure, been described in literature, numerous times, but there's a metamorphosis you go through where, you start law enforcement and, you start to hate the people that you're serving because they're all the ones you come in contact with are, victimizing other people, or they're under the influence, or they're all at some sort of extremist that's, uniformly negative, and they do not want to see you. They do not want to have anything to do with you. Sometimes you have to use force against them. Sometimes you have to hurt them to do your job, and sometimes they hurt you. And none of that exists, or very little of that exists, in EMS. Where in EMS, you're kind of, like I said, there's humanity in helping others, directly helping others. And certainly law enforcement is helping society generally, but it does so by virtue of the police powers to make people do things that, are either detrimental to society, to themselves, or to others. And so that dynamic doesn't overcome you right away. There's, I can't think of any watershed moments where I went, everybody hates me, just because I'm wearing this badge. It happens over time. And in fact, at one point I went back and recertified as a paramedic just so I could recapture, I'd go out and work a few shifts with the ambulance company, and it's just so I could recapture a little bit of that quickly draining humanity. And you can feel it almost palpably in your attitude towards, when you walk into a call, you're on edge, you're expecting, to be treated poorly, and maybe even somebody trying to hurt or kill you. And so that over time, that's kind of very psychically and mentally destructive.
Prior to the shooting in 97, what was some of the, again, career calls or near misses or even loss of colleagues that you had in that period?
Well, I remember a few funerals. I remember losing a friend, Rick McHale. He attempted to detain somebody who was mentally ill. And he was alone, one-man car. The guy overpowered him and beat him with his own firearm to the point where he was unrecognizable. And I can remember going into the hospital and seeing him in the bed and thinking, that's not Rick. That doesn't look anything like Rick. He survived a couple days, and then he finally passed. And at the time, I didn't really internalize that. It was certainly a striking and emotionally draining event. But it wasn't until June of 1987 when I was just sitting there doing some paperwork, and I saw this motorcycle drive through the parking lot where I stopped to do my paperwork. Didn't have any headlights on. It's the middle of the night, no helmet. So I tossed my clipboard into my briefcase and, put it in drive and pulled in behind him and pulled him over. As soon as I got him pulled over, I trained my spotlight on him. I started to get out of the car, and he started to push his motorcycle out of the curtain of light that I, was shown on him. Got on my PA and told him to stay put, not to move. Got out of my car and started walking towards him, and he again kind of pushed his bike out of the headlights and spotlight. And I again ordered him to stop. I approached him. He was really nervous, sweating. It was a warm evening, but he hadn't been doing anything physical except riding his motorcycle, so he shouldn't have been sweating like he was. And he was obviously, he kept looking around, checking the area while he was talking to me. I got his license, or his California ID, ran his license, and as I was waiting for the, warrant return from the dispatcher, I was just watching him. I was thinking, man, if I so much as, take a deep breath, he's either going to be on me, or he's going to be, we're going to be in a foot pursuit. So I started to kind of move closer to him. The dispatcher came back 1032F, which is the code for a felony, our code for a felony warrant. And I didn't answer the dispatcher. I didn't react at all, because I knew, he didn't know if that was a response for me or somebody else on the radio. I just wanted to get my hands on him before he took off. So I moved towards him. As I did so, I told him he was under arrest. And we started to struggle. I was able to get behind him, get him in a carotid artery restraint. I don't think they're doing those anymore, but at the time it was, part of the use of force continuum. He went unconscious. I remember I was standing up when he went unconscious. So I let go of him. He fell down to the ground. I can remember his head hitting the pavement. And I remember thinking, oh, crap, now I'm going to have to spend the rest of the night, while he gets checked out in the hospital, because, I've dropped him and he's probably been injured. So I get down, I get one handcuff on one wrist, and before I can get the second handcuff on him, he just explodes underneath me. He's just like a flurry of movement, and we're wrestling again. And so I managed to work my way around behind him, and I try to, try the carotid artery restraint again. But he'd learned, he knew that if I got my arm around his neck completely, he was going to be unconscious again. So he put his chin down to his chest, and he began chewing on my forearm. And I remember thinking, well, fuck that. I'll just break his jaw. And I started pulling back harder, and suddenly I felt something. It felt just like somebody had shoved a hot poker into my back, and then through my arm, and then into my leg. And I realized I'd been stabbed. And, we continued to struggle, and I stood up, and I kind of pushed him away from me. And as he was, kind of falling back away from me, I drew and I fired. And I remember he said something like, okay. And then he took off running across the street. And as he ran, I fired again. And before he turned right, and the second time I fired, he just dropped like he was a sack of potatoes, like he was completely limp. But then he sprung up again, almost as if I hadn't even shot him and went running down the fence line towards the next block. I fired a total of 6 times, 7 times. I remember the last time, just before he went around the corner, I can remember my front sight between his shoulder blades. I squeezed off the last shot and he disappeared around the corner. At that point, I got on the radio and I told the dispatcher, 999, 998, officer stabbed, shots fired, I'm in foot pursuit. And I went after him. And I got around the corner. He was nowhere to be seen. But I saw a couple of, teenagers, few, 10, 15 yards away, and ran up to him. And I says, hey, did you see somebody run this way? And I can still remember their eyes were about as big around as $50. And, I was standing there, a smoking gun in one hand and my flashlight in the other. And the kid goes, yeah, he went down that alley back there. We heard the shots and we're scared. I says, well, go home. And I turned around. I went back to the alley. And at first I didn't see him, but I found him about 25, 30 yards down the alley, face down. And that was, I put my gun on him. I remember thinking, okay, my slide's forward. It didn't lock back on an empty magazine, so I must have at least 1 round left. And so if he so much as moves, that 1 round is going to go into his head. And, he didn't move. My backup got there a few minutes later. I remember hearing the canine officer, he says, I'm with the officer. Looks like he's code 4. And I remember that I thought at the time, well, I'm code 4. Yes, I'm standing, but I'm definitely not okay. I've got a few extra holes in me. And they finally, got me, got him cuffed up and started taking care of me. And I ended up, being transferred to the hospital. I came back to work about a year later. The suspect didn't survive the incident. What happened during that, though, as, kind of, violent and visceral as that all was, that I was worried about afterwards, when I knew, I was probably going to live, was I was worried about the mistake that I had made while I was taking him into custody. What we learn in the academy when you apply a carotid artery restraint is that you once they go unconscious, you go down to your knees, and then you use a very specific type of control hold to roll them over on their back and keep them in control while you put the handcuffs on. But I didn't do that. I just, I did like I'd learned in the jail when I'd worked in corrections. I just, rendered him unconscious and let go of him. And in a jail setting, even though that would have been wrong, even in the jail, you've got backup, your other officers are around. Usually when that happens, there's not a problem with them regaining consciousness. But because I didn't do that, he was able to regain consciousness and, continue the fight. And had I done it correctly, I likely would have been able to control him. And I was really worried afterwards because I thought, man, I'm in trouble. I screwed up and somebody's dead. And, that's not good. So I remember when the investigator came in to, ask me what happened in the hospital, I'm like, well, I told him what I did, and I'm like, I'm in trouble, aren't I? And he's like, no, you're fine. He says, that's just the sort of thing that happens in, combat. And I'm like, okay. And, I was, on one hand, I was relieved to hear that, but on the other hand, I still figured that somebody eventually was going to read his report and think, oh, well, this is fucked up. Morgan did this wrong. And now, the consequences when you're injured like that are huge. I mean, the medical bills, the people that worry about you, the public attention. I mean, there's just so much energy that is expended when somebody in public service is injured. To be responsible for all of that consequence just weighed on me. And I kept thinking, this is my fault. If I'd done my job right, none of this would have happened. He would have been in custody. He'd have gone to jail, and I'd have gone home that night. Instead, all of this other stuff occurs, and when you're in the middle of it, you can see how monumental it all is, and how unnecessary it felt to me that that all of this should result from something I did wrong. And so, I got out of the hospital and time went on and I didn't get in trouble. They gave me a fucking medal. And I accepted it. But it never sat right with me. It was like this thing stuck in my mind constantly, that you made this mistake. And that led to a lot of kind of introspection about, what's my duty now? I've recognized this. I've looked at this clear-eyed. I don't think, I'm having like an emotional reaction to what I saw and did. I think that was reasonable minds can differ whether it's reasonable for me to make a mistake in a circumstance like that, such as that. But you can't deny that if your failure to do your job properly results in something of such consequence, that you have some responsibility for that. And that led me to, well, what's my responsibility? They're not going to hold me to account. The department thinks I'm some sort of hero, and my friends think I am. But what do I do? Do I stand up on a pedestal and say, hey, you should stone me. I'm bad. I did a bad thing and I should be punished. And that didn't make any sense to me. But what did make sense to me was that it should never happen again. And I could control that. I couldn't control any of that other crap, but I could control the type of officer I was. And that was like, for me, that was like marching orders. That was like a quest I was on then to be the best deputy sheriff that I could possibly be. And I went about it deliberately. I started taking classes. I spent my own money. I sent myself to gun sight in Arizona. I sent myself to combat shotgun training. And I paid for all of this. Like I said, I paid for all of this myself because to me, it was my responsibility. I became a field training officer. I applied for and got accepted to the SWAT team. I started taking my prerequisites for law school because I thought that would be, like a scholastic type of approach to me being better at my job that would, again, prevent me from doing something stupid like this, like I had done in the future. And that I spent the next 10 years of my career constantly going through scenarios in my head. I learned about visualization, and I spent almost every waking hour of not only my on-duty life, but off-duty life, gaming, survival of lethal encounters at any point in my life, at any point in my day. And all of this became like second nature for me. And that, kind of led to the event you mentioned earlier, the shooting 10 years later, almost exactly 10 years later.
What was just before we get to that, what was the backstory of the man on the bike? What was his criminal history, and why was he so nervous at that moment?
He was a longtime meth addict, petty criminal. He had a burglary warrant, so he knew, he was going to jail. And he was tweaking at the time. He was coming down. He was still under the influence of methamphetamine, but he was probably going to be needing one soon to get his blood levels back up. So he was in that stage where they're all fidgety and nervous, even if nothing else is happening. So yeah, 21 years old, local family, local known criminal.
Yeah. Well, we'll get to that, but I mean, obviously, I'm the backstory of how these young men get to this point is also, an important part of this conversation. And it seems like even back then, when you're looking in the mirror, not feeling comfortable with the applause and the medals, this is, that shared humanity and knowing that all of us are on this path until it bifurcates and sends some on a good path and some on a bad path. So with that being said, talk to me about April 13th, 1997.
Okay, well, that was my first night with a brand new trainee. I'd just gotten back from the Baker to Vegas race like the day before. In the previous 3 months, my wife and I had run like 3 trail marathons. That's what we did for fun, was run long distances. I'm sure you probably heard of the Baker to Vegas race. That's a 120-mile relay that goes from Baker, California to Las Vegas. And I was part of the sheriff's team, that ran, the race every year. And so, like I said, I just finished my leg of that. So suffice to say, at the time, I was in pretty good physical condition. I was, like I said, a field training officer. I was on the SWAT team. Brand new trainee. When I say brand new, Dave had actually been in court services for a number of years, and he was transferring out to go to a substation and work the streets. And he'd been through field training before, but because he'd been through field training before, he wasn't going to go through a full program with me like you would normally go through. He'd normally spend 4 weeks with me, and then he'd go to 2 other training officers for 4 weeks and then come back to me for 2 more weeks. In his case, he was just going to spend, I think, 4 weeks with me and then be sent back out on the street. But the thing is that Dave, he's, like I said, he's been working court services for the last, 20 years of his, 15 years of his career. So he hasn't been on the street. He's got to relearn, how to use the radio, get some beat knowledge, get comfortable with, dealing with people in a street environment versus, a courtroom environment. But as soon as we get in the car, I haven't even really been able to talk to him that much and find out much more about him. But we get a call for shots fired in the area of Brook and Madison, right in the center of our beat. And it was, that's shots fired in that neighborhood were, entirely common at any time of the day, but especially at night. So I wasn't particularly on guard, when we went down there any more than I would normally be. We get to the area, we pull up in an old Pinto and parked in front of a residence, and you can see 2 heads in the front seat of the car. And so we pull in behind it and light it up, and I asked Dave if he felt comfortable, to go up and contact the passenger, and I told him I would stand outside and watch. so he could get right into it. So he walks up to the passenger, motions for him to roll the window down. I can see they're having a conversation from where I'm at, and I'm back probably 30 feet from the car, up kind of forward of the passenger or the driver's door. So I can even see into the front windshield, but they can't see me because of the bright spotlights and high beams from the patrol car. And I'm just watching Dave and watching the driver, and making sure that, he doesn't do something, concerning. And Dave gets the passenger out and he starts doing a pat down search on him. As he's patting him down, he yells out something like, "I've got a gun," or "I've got a weapon," and as soon as he says that, the kid that he's patting down takes off running down the street. And I'm kind of equal or even to where he's at on the street, but kind of on the other side of the street or in the far lane, and I go running after it. Dave sees the kid go around the corner and into a backyard, and he decides he's going to go around the other side of the house to cut him off. I come around the corner, swinging wide in the corners, cutting the pie, making sure, that I don't run up on him. And as I come around the back of the house, I see him trying to force his way into the back door of the house. So at this point, I've got, kind of a bit of a conundrum. My partner says, "Oh, I've got a gun." So does he mean he's got the gun? Did he get the gun away from the kid? I don't see anything in the kid's hands, so there's no gun in his hands. I'm not entirely sure of my backstop. The walls in those houses in that neighborhood are, can be pretty thin. If I fire and miss, do I end up hitting somebody, in that bedroom or room that he's trying to get into? I yell at him to stop, show me his hands, turn around. He keeps trying to get into the residence. Now, I've got a choice there. Do I use deadly force? I didn't feel I had enough to use deadly force at that point. No visible weapon. He's not making any threatening gestures towards me. But he's also not following my orders. Can I let him get into that residence? If he gets into the residence and shuts the door, what do I do? I've got a barricaded suspect. There could be innocent people in that house. I made the decision at that point to close on him and prevent him from entering the house and try to take him into custody. And that, at that point, the fight's on. He's shorter than I am, maybe 5'8", maybe 200, 220, stocky. So he's a handful. And as we struggle, all my equipment, I lose my primary sidearm, comes out of my holster, my baton comes out, my pepper spray is gone. And as we're struggling, I can suddenly kind of feel his hands or arms going down to his belt line. And the next thing I know, there's like this brilliant flash and I can't feel anything. I'm like floating in a bath of warm water with, I can't feel pressure. I can't feel my body. And I remember being just incredibly frustrated because I'd been training myself for the past 10 years for this exact circumstance, the fight for my life, against somebody trying to kill me. And when you run scenarios, visualizations, you always prevail. You never run a visualization where you fail, where you die. You always win. You're always able to do something. And needless to say, so I never gamed out what I would do if I was paralyzed, because it's kind of a senseless exercise. And it was overwhelmingly frustrating. But suddenly I was able to move. As soon as I was able to move, I started, I remember, feeling around in the ground for a weapon, because he's standing over me at this point and kind of, looking around as like he's looking for my partner. I can't, I can't find a weapon around me. But I reach into my vest pocket where I keep my backup weapon. I pull it out. As I pull my backup weapon and point it at him, he grabs it out of my hand, turns around, points it at me, and pulls the trigger. My backup weapon didn't go off, so he cycles the slide, points it at me again, and pulls the trigger. Again, it doesn't go off. He cycles the slide and points it at me and pulls the trigger. At this point, like I said, I'm out of weapons, so I was able to grab a board that was sitting nearby, like a long stick or piece of lumber, and I picked it up and I hit him in the side of the head with it. He kind of, backs away, and then he comes right back at me and punches me between the eyes with his fist. I go down. When I come back up, he's gone. And I remember thinking at the time, nobody's ever died standing up. So I stood up and I started moving around to the front of the residence. He had shot me with a .410 caliber single shot Derringer. It was loaded with a high base round of birdshot. About 130 pellets entered my neck right about here, along with the wadding, and kind of distributed throughout the interior of my neck. My brief paralysis was probably when those pellets hit my spine. Miraculously, even though I have several that are up against my carotid artery and jugular veins, none of them pierced through those large major veins or arteries. I got around to the front of the house. I kind of laid down on the ground, and a little while later, a good friend, another good friend of mine named Dave, came up to me, and he's checking me out, and I told him, because I knew this was bad. I told him to tell Christy I love her. I'd been married a year before to my beautiful bride, Christy. And he looks at me and he goes, "You can tell her yourself." And, I just let him go to work on me then. The suspect, Jason, 16 or 17-year-old Jason Samuel, had run around the front of the house, broken in the front door with my backup gun still, and got into a struggle with the occupant of the house, who was a drug dealer, we found out later. And actually, a round discharged from my gun inside the house while they were struggling over the gun. Eventually, the drug dealer got the gun away from him and then threw him out the front door to the waiting cops. And a few minutes later, he threw the gun out. They loaded me up in the ambulance. And as I was en route to the hospital, the swelling from the injury, was getting worse and worse. And each breath, it was like crazy that each breath I took, I thought, okay, this is the last one, and then I'd somehow managed to squeeze another one through there, and that happened. It was like each time was this like final effort for me, over and over again as we drove to the hospital. And I remember I thought to myself, I've got to calm down. I've got to, just, relax and, not panic. And then maybe it'll be easier to breathe. So I closed my eyes and I just tried to concentrate on each breath, and which completely freaked out the poor deputy that had been sent to ride me to the hospital. He's like screaming at me, Tom, open your eyes. You're going to be okay. You can make it, And unfortunately, I can't talk at that point, but I just want to tell him, hey, Eric, man, I just need to chill. I need to relax. And so I don't suffocate before I get to the hospital. we eventually got to the hospital, and the last thing I remember was that bright light of the emergency room sign. It's right over the emergency room doors. It's big red lettering, emergency. They opened the back door, and they're getting ready to take me out. And that I thought, okay, I've made it this far. I can't take another breath. It's up to you guys. I'm in the hands of the Current Medical Center emergency department, and they did a pretty good job. They were able to get me intubated, took me into surgery, were able to get a few of the pellets out. But I needed somebody with a little more experience than that, so they tossed me in a helicopter and flew me down to UCLA, where I spent probably about a month after that, getting additional surgeries and getting patched up before they sent me home.
On the physical side first, what was the damage inflicted by that 410 round?
It just turned this section of my neck into like hamburger. All those pellets had just gone through there and ripped all of the muscle tissue. And I remember asking the doctor, the head and neck surgeon, and I couldn't talk afterwards when I was in the hospital. I had to write everything down. So I wrote to the doctor, what's my prognosis? And he looks at me, he goes, well, we've never actually had anybody survive an injury like this, so we're not sure. We're just going to have to see. I'm like, thanks, doc.
Thanks to the bedside confidence.
Yeah, I found out that head and neck surgeons don't have to have good bedside manners because, their patients usually aren't in a condition where they care that much. So, and he, true to form, he was a good guy. He saved my ass, but he did not pull punches when you asked him questions.
Now, what about Christy? Obviously, this is going to be an important part of the conversation later as well. You're newlyweds. This happens, even though she's witnessing you being extremely diligent in your preparation for this position. What is the impact on her in those initial few weeks?
Well, it was devastating. It's something that was one of the many lessons that thing taught me was it's a lot easier to get injured than it is to watch someone you love get injured. I would take that every day of the week, getting run over by a car, getting shot, getting stabbed, if I turn it around, if I thought about it, if I had to watch her go through that, no way. If you gave me a choice between the two, I'd say, start it up, let's go, do me, because I can't watch somebody I love, get hurt. And that was really hard, because, our job is to fix things, right? As a medic, as a cop, you're in charge. You're supposed to fix everything. The solution may not always be elegant, or the best one, but by God, you're gonna come up with one. And that was one of the hardest lessons I learned. Over the next 18 years, was how little we can do to fix other people, and but of course at the beginning I struggled. I wanted to fix things. I wanted to help her, and I couldn't. I was the one that needed help, and so and that's also in contrast. It's not her job to help me either. But of course, I thought my job was to help her, and she thought her job was to help me. But none of those things they're not even remotely possible. And so you have these two people, constantly, in conflict and at odds with their primary directive, to help the one they love, when all along they're neglecting the only thing that really matters, and that's themselves. And that's the kind of dynamic I found myself in for the next, 15 years. And what happens when people, when they're injured or when they're in pain, what the thing about injury and pain is that it's something somebody does to you or something that happens to you. It may not be somebody that does it. It could be a rock falling off a cliff, or, you trip on a crack in the sidewalk. But whatever it is, it's not you. You're not doing it to yourself. Somebody else does it to you. And so you feel the pain, you experience the trauma, and then it's human nature, when you're trying to react to that, to become angry, for this pain that's been done to you, regardless of, and it really, trauma is like fungible. It doesn't really matter how it's caused or what causes it. If you're damaged somehow by something or someone, you're going to feel pain, and then you're going to be angry initially at whatever caused that pain. But eventually, much like trauma, anger is also fungible. It doesn't really care who it eventually focuses on. And the amount of pain and anger that Christy had experienced in my nearly losing my life was earth-shattering. She's a passionate person, just anyway. And the damage that had been done, the pain that had been inflicted on her, both growing up and with my injury, turned her into somebody, that at times I didn't recognize at all. And because we were together all the time, we had no family that lives close, but I would argue that wouldn't really make any difference. We kind of retreated into our home and into our lives, and we were left to deal with the consequences of that pain and that anger, which, she often turned on me. And to be fair, she would turn it on anything, that gave her an opportunity. But that led to deep depression, guilt, drug abuse, addiction. And a lot of this, it resulted from her not having a difficult time trusting people, because she'd been abandoned when she was a child by her mother. And in some ways, she looked on my injury as an abandonment of her. I had been the rock in the relationship, working, protecting. And then suddenly I'm like, useless, I'm like recovering and not able to do the things that I'd been able to do before, which is a form of abandonment again. And in my recognition of that, I saw that the one thing that I could do was that I could be trustworthy. I could be somebody that she could always know, had her best interest at heart. But one of the consequences of that was like I said, she was addicted to barbiturates, and I never, until she disclosed that, one day in a speech in front of a bunch of people that we gave after our victim offender dialogue. I'd never told anyone that. I hadn't gone to a counselor. I hadn't told a friend. I'd told none of my relatives. I kept my promise to her that I wouldn't disclose that because it wasn't my information to disclose. And I know it's good to talk about things, that we struggle with. I know the value of disclosure, of disclosing our struggles to others so we can gain strength from that. But for me, it was much more important to maintain that trust with her than almost anything else. That it was important to me that she know that of every other person on the world, in the face of this planet, that I was the one person that would never breach that trust. And so I never, ever, not to anyone, said, I'm living with an addict. Which, created a bit of a conundrum because how I came to understand that I had to take care of her. The first thing I had to do was take care of myself. And how do I take care of myself if I can't talk to somebody about what I'm going through? And the for me anyway, the inescapable conclusion was that I had to be happy with myself, with my life, with my circumstance. I had to be content with it, however it was. And that required that I internalized that, we're only responsible for ourselves and we can't help anybody else. And so, I went back to law school. When I got injured, I was in my third year. I got on with my life. I continued, my physical activities. And I took care of myself to the best of my ability by myself without sharing any of that with anyone else. And over time, I reached a kind of an equilibrium where I was happy. It was sad for me to watch her go through her struggles, but I knew that if I let them destroy me, that if she should ever come through to the end of this in one piece, that I wanted to still be there for her when she, was strong enough to take those steps. And so that meant that I couldn't pretend to be happy. I had to be happy. I had to be satisfied in my life because, people know. They know if you're faking it. And, there were times I didn't, I wondered whether, anything was ever going to work out, whether she was ever going to get off the drugs, whether she was ever going to be happy again. And I just thought, there's nothing I can do about that. I can't change her, but I can be here. And if I'm happy with the cards that we've been dealt, then maybe she'll look at me and think, well, maybe it's possible for me to do the same thing. And so that was kind of, I don't know, it was like this test that I was undergoing during this time to see whether or not I was capable of being content with the life that I was living. sincerely, honestly content with it. And, did I always pass? Was I always, come to the right conclusion? Did I always do what I was supposed to do? Fuck no. I mean, I made so many mistakes. I did so badly so many times that, where things could have, gone completely into the shitter, that I can't tell you. But somehow I always managed to keep enough of my wits about me not to destroy what we had and to maintain my kind of forward and upward momentum in my life. And then we got that notice that Jason, the kid that shot me, was up for parole. I hadn't expected that to happen when it did. He was supposed to be in prison for another 5 years, but what I hadn't noticed in the meantime, since his sentencing, was that they passed some juvenile offender statutes that allowed him to be eligible sooner than he might have been otherwise. And he'd applied, and I remember I didn't want to tell Christy that he was up for parole, because anything at that point in our lives, it'd been 18 years since the shooting. Like I said, we'd reached a kind of an equilibrium in our lives. She was still addicted, still angry, still, struggling with her demons. But our dynamic was, I loved her. I was with her and I wasn't going to leave. And, but things like, anything could set her off and kind of bring her back to that time when I got shot. A knock on the door. We might be watching something on TV and there'll be an advertisement for a cop show. And they'll show some cop on a ventilator in a hospital. Any of these things could just drive her, into deep depression. And I was afraid that this, parole hearing thing might do the same thing. So I wasn't even going to show up for it. I was just going to kind of ignore it, pretend it didn't happen. And I thought, well, hopefully they'll keep him in prison. So, the hearing's approaching. I get contacted by the DA's office, who was one of my law school classmates. And he starts telling me about all of the things that they're doing to show up at the parole hearing and make sure that Jason doesn't get out. And I think to myself, crap, I can't let them do all this work after, everything that the department and the DA's office has done for me. I can't let them do all of this and not at least show up the day of the hearing. And so I tell Christy, and, it was like the first surprise of many. She's like, okay, well, if you think you have to do that, and I told her I was going to, tell the board that he should stay in prison. And I prepared for the day. I prepared for his parole hearing like I would prepare for a court case. I was ready to, I was going to tell the board, keep him in prison, he should never get out. And I remember showing up for the hearing, and, they bring him in, and he's not at all what I expected. I remember him from the trial, this, kind of husky, by that time, he was 18 years old. He was tried as an adult. But, he comes into the parole hearing, he's kind of overweight, he's wearing glasses, he's kind of shuffling in, his head's down. He looks like he's beaten. And I wrote on my legal pad, not what I expected. And then they proceeded with the hearing. And I don't know if you've ever been to a parole hearing, but it's sort of like this emotional or psychic autopsy. They take a human being apart piece by piece, every fault, everything you've ever done, your criminal history, your family history, and he wasn't old enough to have a real significant criminal history when he shot me, but his family history was horrific. And then they go through his psychological profile. And I don't know if you've ever, had a psychological profile done on you. But I mean, even if you were perfectly adjusted, I think that would be a painful thing to have to face. Somebody objectively going through every one of your little mental foibles and faults and problems. But they finished that. Then the DA got up, to give their argument. His attorney got up to give her argument. And then Jason gets to make a statement. And he talked for a while. One of the significant things is that he basically admitted to everything that actually happened, which he had denied at trial. He said he shot me in self-defense and that it was an accident. Or rather, not self-defense. He said that the gun had gone. He was trying to throw the gun away, and that it had accidentally gone off. Well, if you know anything about derringers, single shot, single action derringers, that you don't accidentally. You've got to cock the thing for it to fire, and you don't carry it cocked. So, but during the parole hearing, he admitted to everything that he'd done. He admitted to taking the gun away from me, my backup gun, and pointing it at me and trying to kill me with it 3 times.
Just to jump in there, because I'm sure people listening were wondering what happened. So explain why he wasn't actually able to fire that weapon.
Yeah, the weapon I carried as a backup was a HK P7, which has a squeeze cocking mechanism on the front of the grip. It's there's really no other weapon like it. It's not a safety. It actually needs to be cocked with that grip device, and so it takes a little pressure. You can't. It takes about 12 pounds of pressure to actually cock it, and so he didn't know that when he was trying to use it, and so he just kept racking live rounds out of the chamber. When it wouldn't fire. And apparently when it did fire in the house, while they were struggling with it, he somehow managed to get it, cocked accidentally. But that's why the gun didn't go off. But he then said 2 things during the hearing that really, really stuck with me. One was he said that he'd always looked at cops as just another gang. And then he told a story about how an officer had come in during one of his self-help groups in prison and had, asked Jason, what do you do? What are you doing in prison? What'd you get convicted for? And he said he sat down and he told this retired officer, the whole story. And he said he thought that he would get to the end of it. This ex-cop would, be critical of him, criticize him, and tell him that, he was evil and that he'd done a bad thing and that he regretted talking to them. But instead, the ex-cop looked at him and said, son, you're not the worst thing you've ever done. You can do something different with your life. You've made a mistake. You're paying the price for that, but that doesn't define who you are. And I remember him telling this story in the hearing, and tears are streaming down his face, and the remorse and regret are just palpable in him. And I remember thinking, wow, if this guy that he didn't even know, had that kind of an effect on him, what kind of effect would I have if I did the same thing, if I sat down with him? And the other thing about, they said about I mean, I thought a lot about this after the hearing. He got denied parole at that first hearing. And later, when I'm thinking about it, his statement about him looking at cops as just another gang, I thought, given his upbringing, we were both products of our, environment. We were both products of, who and how we lived and the things we learned. His product, what he became was almost preordained by, all of these factors that he had no control over. His broken home, his father in prison, his mother addicted, his being shuffled from foster home to foster home, his, lack of education, his involvement in criminal gangs. I mean, many of these young men, that's the only recognition and positive influences they have in their life are gang members. I mean, when you think about how kind of twisted that is, at least from our point of view, when I looked at all of that together, I thought, well, we were kind of both doing what we were trained to do by our lives, and we were like two, missiles that had been fired off, at birth, and we were heading on this, collision course, and we met, behind that house that night, and the result was violence. And the more I thought about it, the more I thought it would have been strange had it not ended the way that it did. So I couldn't look at what he had done and take it personal because, I mean, he didn't even know me. I mean, he hated cops, but he had a legitimate reason to hate cops from his point of view. My job was to catch people that were breaking the law and, bring them to justice. I was doing what I was supposed to be doing. And, when I looked at that, it put me in his shoes, where I had not ever really been before. And that coupled with the idea that, it would be so easy for me to try to be a positive influence on him. It would also be really easy to be a negative influence. I could insist that he stay in prison. I could say that he's evil and that, he'll never amount to anything, but he's going to get out eventually. And what kind of person do I want, out on the street? Do I want somebody who I've encouraged and who I've, at least given the dignity of, talking to him? Or do I want somebody who's, whenever he thinks about me, all he remembers is that asshole at the parole hearing that, said that he should stay in prison for the rest of his life? And the choice seemed really simple. I wasn't angry at him. I understood at least a little more about where he had come from and why he had done what he had done. He had taken ownership of it. And I had a chance to do something positive in his life. And I had a message for him, that I wanted to tell him that I had learned over the previous 18 years, living the life that I had led, and that there was power in adversity, that the bad things in your life can turn into some of the greatest assets if you let them do that. And I truly believe in that based upon my life with Christy. I saw our lives together, however objectively difficult it might seem, as being my greatest strength. My love for her felt like the linchpin in my existence. And it meant that I had to focus on myself, not to the exclusion of her and my love for her, but I don't know, to give it substance, to to allow her something to, I don't know, use as an example, or something that she could depend on in her life of unpredictability. And I saw that in Jason's life. I saw that he could take the bad things that had happened to him and use them to, talk to other, young gang members and say to them, hey, this is how I've lived my life. And I thought, what better credibility than the life he's led to bring that message to other people than what he's gone through. And so at Jason's second parole hearing, I made that offer. I said, I told the parole board, I says, I'm going to leave the decision in your hands, but whatever happens, I want to talk to Jason because of these things that he had said and the thoughts that I've had since his first parole hearing. And they didn't have any idea what to do with that. They're used to, people coming in and, pounding the table and say, please don't let this person out. They again denied him parole, but I was left with no way to, get in touch with Jason, and that was a genuine offer that I'd made. So I got a hold of the Department of Corrections, and I got a hold of the victim and survivor services for CDCR. And I asked, is there some way that I could meet with Jason? I have a message for him. And they put me in touch with a facilitator for a program called the Victim Offender Dialogue Program. Martina Lutz Snyder was my facilitator, and she started a series of meetings between her and I and her and Jason to arrange for this to happen, to make sure it wasn't going to be damaging for me and it wasn't going to be damaging for him, and that it didn't, create problems for his, incarceration. And while that was going on, we got approached by, she got approached by a CNN production company that was, it was doing a series called The Redemption Project with Van Jones. And they were interviewing people who were, going back into prison and outside of prison to talk to people that had harmed them, to find out, how those dialogues, those conversations changed their lives. And I said, sure. Yeah, I think that'd be I think there's a good message, and I'd love to do it. Jason agreed to do it. The only person I had left to convince was my wife, who, to go back a little bit, it would be hard to understate the amount of hate and anger she had for Jason. Just after the shooting, her and one of the scout snipers for the SWAT team were actually plotting to assassinate Jason without my knowledge. Now, I don't know if he was just, giving her an outlet for her anger, or whether they were seriously considering it. But I know she was seriously considering it. And her anger for him was intense and ongoing for a decade or more. So when I came to Christy and I told her about we were going to do this, that I did, was thinking about doing this CNN thing, I expected her to, dive into depression and, for her anger to resurface. But to my surprise, what she told me was, if you think this is something you have to do, I'll support you. And so we started preparing, doing the shooting for the documentary, which she didn't want to have any part of. we're coming up to the victim offender dialogue, and the facilitator Martinez, asks me if I need a support person for the dialogue, and I'm like, nah, I should be fine. I'm not really doing this for me. And she says, no, you should really consider having somebody with you, so that you can share that experience, so that because this is one of those things that just doesn't happen that often, and you want to be able to talk to somebody about this as the years go by and you reflect on it. I'm like, sounds like a good idea. I'll see who I can come up with. So I'm sitting in bed with Christy one night, and, going down my list, people, my short list of people that I want to, ask to do this. And I ask her if she, what she thinks. And she goes, well, what about me? And I was like, well, what? That was like the last thing in the world. I expected that she would volunteer to be within like even 20 miles of Jason, let alone, be in the same room or anywhere near him. I said, sure. I mean, if you want to do that, I said, that'd be great, because you're definitely the person I'm closest to. And so the day before the dialogue, we had like a dry run where we took Christy to San Quentin, and, just to experience the whole getting into a prison thing and seeing what it's like. And she'd never been in one before. And my facilitator was there. She had someone with her as well from the program. And like, I don't know if you've ever been in a prison, but San Quentin's like the archetypal imposing prison on the planet. It's this huge rock and stone edifice perched on the San Francisco Bay, surrounded by barbed wire and gun towers. And it's just imposing. And so we bring Christy there the day before, and we're walking up from the parking lot to the first gates to get in. And literally, I'm holding one arm. Martinez, or her facilitator, Allison's holding the other arm. And it's like pulling somebody through like peanut butter. She's just, she obviously does not want to do this. She's everything in her is saying, run, get away, you don't want to do this. And it's funny, we don't really understand how strong people are, until they're, not given a choice. I honestly had no idea how strong my wife was. I had hope that she was that strong, but you never, everything to that point had not pointed, like on a day-to-day basis, that she possessed the kind of strength that it took to do what she was doing. And then I can remember we're holding on to her and we're walking up to the prison, and all of a sudden I can feel her straightening up, and she kind of, puts her shoulders back, her chest out, and she goes, fuck it. And she just walks away from me and Allison standing there, at the gates of San Quentin to go into that prison. And I was like completely amazed. I had no idea that was going to happen. And I thought, man, I've underestimated this woman for the last time. So, we go through that. The next day, we have the victim offender dialogue. Jason comes out. We have a great conversation. He tells me that, I've said things to him that his own father had never said to him. He's crying. He's remorseful. He's listening to what I'm saying about, because I wanted to tell him about the power that he had. I told him, your adversity is like a superpower that you need to grab onto. You just need to realize it, the strength that you can gain from the things that you've gone through. And he says he understands. He keeps apologizing for what he had done. And we come to the break, and the producer comes up to me and he says, Christy wants to talk to Jason. And I'm like, what the fuck? I mean, I'm like, well, I gotta hear this out of her mouth, because that doesn't even sound like it's, that does not sound like you were talking to my wife. Because, I mean, she was even nervous, that morning when we came into the prison, even after that dry run. She was obviously anxious. She didn't want to be there. She was scared to death of him and angry at the same time. So I go to talk to Christy, and, she's in tears, and she says, I'm so ashamed of myself. And I'm like, what are you ashamed of? She says, I hated him for so long, and I didn't know who I was hating. I didn't know any of this stuff about his life, about what he'd been through. I didn't know how sorry he was and how much he regretted what he had done. I didn't know all of the things that he'd done to make himself a better person. She says, and all I did was hate. She says, I want to tell him that I forgive him and that I'm sorry. I'm like, okay. I'm like, yeah, what am I going to say? So we come back out, we start up the dialogue again. They asked Jason if he, minded if Christy spoke with him, and he said he agreed to that. And I've said this, I don't know, a million times, but I will never see another more perfect moment of grace than when my wife walked out and put her arms around the man that had tried to kill me and forgave him. It was, I told you that I would never underestimate my wife's strength after the day before, but the day after just proved to me what an amazing woman she is. And, to kind of make a really long story shorter, hopefully, in the following months, she quit. She got off the drugs. It was like, and she said it herself, it was like a huge weight, that anger and hate. When she got rid of it, it was like this huge weight that had been lifted off her shoulders. And she, the woman I married, was back, happy, content. Any anger she had, before all of this happened, with the life that she led, that was gone. She was happy to be alive, and I was so thankful that I was there to witness that, that I hadn't, in my attempts to help, screwed it up, at some point prior to that. It was such an amazing lesson for me.
Watching the documentary, the Van Jones CNN documentary, I sent you a picture this morning of your wife hugging Jason. I don't know if I mentioned in the text that I was sobbing like a 3-year-old girl when I was watching it, because to me, especially as we sit here now in, whatever it is, March 2026, with the divisiveness and more wars starting again, and coming out the back end of the division of COVID and the pandemic and the George Floyd incidents, and insert whatever you want, this well, we just combat hate with more hate kind of rhetoric that we're getting at the moment. It is literally what the world needs at the moment, is to hear stories like this. And I've said this many times on here, we were left ancient wisdom. If you subscribe to Christianity or Buddhism or Sikhism, whatever your doctrine is, they're telling us be kind to each other, forgive each other, serve, have community. And watching this real time, or real time on the film, and hearing the backstory, and you and I talking a few weeks ago prior, and hearing the full story of the events leading up to this, it was just so powerful, because it's like that. I'm going to paraphrase, but that hatred is a poison that you keep within yourself. Like it only poisons you. And hearing what I was wondering that you just detailed, that not only did this lead to your wife forgiving Jason, but it also helped her heal and forgive all the trauma that she experienced when she was younger as well. And then hearing the backstory of Jason and his trauma. And, I would imagine if we were able to dive into the backstory of that 21-year-old methamphetamine addict that you had to, take their life, that you would see a similar thing. And so the answer is obviously not throw him in jail, lock away, throw away the key, oh, your friend killed me, I'm going to kill them, like the Crips and Bloods thing. But this is the beautiful example of what's absolutely needed, which is forgiveness. And obviously I'm not pretending that that's going to happen overnight. It didn't with you and your wife, but to hear, the trauma that you went through physically, mentally, your career, your marriage, her sobriety, and then leading to this forgiveness that healed all three of you simultaneously. I mean, I don't know if there's any words that can even describe that, to be honest.
I guess the irony about all of it is that it's actually a lot easier to forgive than it is to be angry. But anger is your initial reaction to pain, and it's also very seductive. It feels good to hate the things that hurt us, at least for a while. And by the time you're being damaged by that hate, you forget that there's any other alternative. And then it's hard, because you've become so invested in that anger and that, that you think if you let loose of that, there won't be anything left, and there's some other episodes in the, that Redemption Project series. There's one where a mother, her daughter was almost killed by a drunk driver, and she wasn't killed, but now she's suffered like these lifelong debilitating injuries, and it's a brain injury, I believe. And the mother has to do everything for her. She has to, kind of get her up in the morning, get her through the day, and the dialogue between the drunk driver that hit her and her and the mother is so painful to watch, because it's cathartic. It's helpful for the woman that was injured, to talk to the person that nearly killed her. But the mother, you can tell, has hated this person for so long and so hard, and she is reminded so constantly on a daily basis of what she's lost, that you could see that conflict, but she can't give into, the idea that forgiveness would free her, because I think she's afraid of not having anything left to go on once that anger is taken away, because that's it's almost as if that sustains her anger, sustains her dedication to her daughter. And I know if she could free herself from that, she would be happy. But you can't tell people to do that. They've got to, it's just like with Christy, you can't. I could have spent 20 years telling her not to hate Jason to no effect, and long before we got to 20 years, she would have resented me to the point that, there's no way we could have stayed together for trying to change her. But by leaving her alone, by not reacting to the anger and leaving mine behind, it allowed her the time to heal herself. And in the end, the whole thing was her. I was so clueless during that kind of stretch of time that it's remarkable. I mean, if you'd have asked me beforehand, hey, what do you think's going to happen? I'd have thought, well, more of the same. She's going to be angry, sad, depressed, frightened of this guy. But because it was her decision, because she was allowed to get to it on her own, she owns that. And there's so much strength in that ownership. And that manifested in her, once, the whole thing was over. Because she knew it. She knew it wasn't, she didn't do that because I wanted her to. She didn't do it because somebody in society told her she should. She did it because she was strong enough to figure it out all by herself. And people, they have to get there on their own. Otherwise, the journey means nothing if somebody else was rowing the boat. You can't, if you get carried to the top of Mount Everest, you don't get to put the flag at the top. It's not the same. And it's so weird that in retrospect, these things seem so obvious. And you talk about the wisdom of the ancients. Isn't that what humanity is all about? This constant, because we all know the right thing to do somewhere in our hearts. And yet we still fight against it when just giving into it would be much easier.
I think there's a couple of things that are just so evident over and over and over again. One is the assumption that bad people are bad because they make bad decisions, and losing sight of the fact that we were all giggling babies, infants. We were, toddlers that were running around chasing a ball and coloring, dogs on paper with crayons and all the innocent things that we are. And then whatever's happened in those formative life combined with the mentors that you have around, because I know a lot of people that had horrific upbringings that became cops and firefighters and soldiers, but they had those people that steered them in that direction. Same people, same trauma. Gangbanger is now their mentor in their community. All of a sudden, they're in Jason's position. So losing sight of that, understanding that the more we heal, the better the environment is, the fewer criminals, the fewer people getting behind the wheel, drunk because they're trying to fill in some void, whatever it is that then leads to this pain. The other thing is there's it's irrefutable that locking people up in cages does not work well for recidivism. And I had the superintendent of Bastøy prison in Norway on a couple of times now, and they shifted their prison model to, it's basically a housing community. These men and women, some of them are murderers. They lost their freedom. They are serving time, but they're living in houses. They cook, they clean, they go to school, they go to work. Their violence on each other and on officers is almost zero. And then the whole, lens is because, as you said, one day these people are going to move in back to your neighborhood. What kind of human do you want coming back? And the Norwegian model has the lowest recidivism of anywhere on the planet. And what they do is they see that these are people that made mistakes. They have to pay for that mistake, but that their mistake doesn't define them, and that most of them, the guy that shot up the summer camp in Norway, is in a box in Norway. He's locked away from society forever. But so many of these people had these poor upbringings, surrounded by poor mentors, made poor decisions, and that you can then do the opposite, surround people with good mentors, forge good decisions, and they can become good members of society again. So that's kind of, my whole perspective. You were in law enforcement, you ultimately transitioned into, the law side itself. Just to round off this conversation, if you were king for a day, what would you do? It can be systemically in society, it can be behind, in the correction system itself. What do we need to change to create more healing journeys like Jason did, and even avoid some of these young people going into the world of crime in the first place?
Well, I guess I would preface that with I don't know that there's anything that we can do. It's a remarkably complex problem. And one of the problems is that fear is such a common tactic, a common political tactic. I remember just a little story to illustrate, a bigger point. I remember when we just finished a SWAT practice, and so it's a room full of type A, high testosterone men, exclusively men. And we were the DA, the elected DA at the time, had dropped by to, I don't know, hang out and chat with some of the team members and the team leader and commander. And I remember he got up, he was kind of giving not really a campaign speech, but he was congratulating us for something, some operation we'd done or something. And I remember him lamenting that, come election time, he was sad that he envied the sheriff, that the sheriff had a SWAT team, the DA. And the reason he did that is because, he wanted that flashy, uniformed kind of, it's the pinnacle of law enforcement. It's something that when you're trying to show your best officers and your best side, it's the SWAT team that gets paraded out. They're the go-getters. They're the ones that really risk their lives, for the most dangerous things. But why is it that is attractive to, a law enforcement administration? I think it's because it feeds on that basic, I don't know if I want to call it a political reality, but that politicians want the society to be afraid of their culture, of their society, because the more afraid they are, the more money they'll give to their protection. And the symbol of their protection, that he was talking about was the SWAT team. And the DA doesn't have that ability. He can't parade out. He's got a bunch of attorneys in suits. That's not going to scare the public. What scares the public is the possibility that a SWAT team might be needed. Not so much that they're scary, but that something might happen that's so bad that the only people that can protect them are these highly trained, officers. And it's that politics of fear, that almost industrialization of fear, that I find, I don't know, it's destructive, I think, in a number of levels. Because it feeds off of people's fear to promote their support of these agencies, it's like people are afraid of their houses burning down, so they have fire departments. We don't do these things and promote them for the right reasons and fund them for the right reasons. We fund them because we're scared. We fund them because, and the scarier it is, the more we fund them. It's like the war against drugs, really. They started a war to, politically back when Nancy Reagan, first started that, to scare people, to give money and funding and support to law enforcement to, fight the war against drugs. And, just like that, the DA on that day, he wished he had a SWAT team he could parade out to scare the public into, around budget time, supporting his department, by providing more money or, more funding. And that, I think that's at the core of so many messages we hear from public safety. And I don't know that there's anything that can be done about that, because it is really the most effective way to, kind of get the population to support something, and that's to, scare the dickens out of them.
Well, just flipping it on its head, because I agree. I mean, exactly what you're talking about. The fact that that's used as leverage to get people scared. This is your brain on drugs. All these other campaigns that we've seen, it works. We've seen that most recently, with the extremes on either side and the kind of messaging they've got. Whether, if you don't have a vaccine, then you're all going to die, and your kids are murdering grandmother if they don't have it, or the other way, everyone that comes from another country is a rapist and a murderer, and we get that extremist rhetoric all the time. You mentioned the war on drugs. I mean, the irony is we know that that's an epic failure. I mean, this is an 80-year longitudinal study that has created cartels and the Crips and the Bloods and all these other things that are empowered by, addicts being forced into the underworld. And when you look in certain countries around the world that said, you know what, this isn't working, we're going to do it differently than America. And Portugal's a good example. They reversed their addiction crisis in 8 years. I had the guy João Goulão, who spearheaded that, the physician in Portugal, because what they did is like, well, we're not arresting our way out of this. It's just not working. So why don't we take the people who are addicts that haven't, robbed houses, stolen cars, all the other things that are also a crime, and they have to pay for that. But if addiction is their crime, being caught with a user's amount of a substance, we're going to funnel them into addiction counseling, job creation, mental health counseling, housing, get them on their feet, get them sober, and then get them back to work. And it does. And that's not everyone. There are still addicts in Portugal that use, medical facilities to get their drugs so they're not dying in gutters in the streets. But everyone else, they got back on their feet. And you want to cut the head off the snake of gangs and cartels, take away their customer. And I know it's not, just flick a switch and it'll happen, but we know that chasing bad guys doesn't work. The number of people I had on the show, like, the moment we arrest someone on a street corner, another one pops up. It's whack-a-mole. It's not fixing the problem. So I think this is just it. We've got to get away from what everyone's told us is the solution, because it doesn't work, and we know it doesn't work. We have 100,000 Americans dying of opioids every year. If the war on drugs worked, Purdue Pharma never would be able to put OxyContin in through the FDA in the first place. But they did, and here we are. So I think that looking at the way we've done it is the perfect opportunity to go, okay, we need something else. And presenting, SWAT teams, even though there's a necessity, when people say, well, why do our police look like they're going to war? It's because we've created war on the streets. Exactly. I mean, there's no better example than what you went through with a member of the Crips. But that doesn't have to be the case. And I think what people have got to take a step back and ask is that, well, why doesn't that happen on the streets of Oslo, or Lisbon, or, Osaka? They don't have this level of violence and addiction and crime and homelessness that we have. So why are we not going to those countries and saying, what are you doing? We need to start copying some of the things that you do.
Yeah, I agree. It's the simplest way, I think, for politicians to, sort of get support for their, the things they want support for. Is that, like I said, it's almost like the industrialization of fear. And if it'd probably be easier to get rid of if it wasn't so effective. And there's no denying that there's a core of truth that runs through so many of the things that we're afraid of, that from unhoused people to immigrants to, gang members, that those are all problems, but or have problematic, aspects to them. But it just, it's like an easy way to get support for something is to, tell people that they should be afraid of something and then set yourself up as the solution to that fear. And I don't know. That's, like I said, it's I I don't have the the wherewithal or the I don't think there is a magic wand for any of this. I think any solutions that there might be are they're going to have to be realized in the long term. Uh, I I really like the idea of focusing more on like the individual, individual people. I'd like the I don't know anything about uh, I went to a struggle well class, uh, put out my Boulder Crest a couple of weeks ago, and the fire chief for who was sponsoring the class, uh, it, obviously he's in charge of the agency. He's an administrator, and he internalized the training from that class, which is the concept of post-traumatic growth. And the first hour, the first day of our class, he got up in front of the class and bared his soul to everyone in there, including the people that were his employees, and showed incredible vulnerability and emotional intelligence. And I don't know if I don't know anything else. I do know that looked a lot like healthy leadership to me. uh, if there were more people like that in all aspects of our life, not just in public service, I think we'd be a lot better off. And that's one of the reasons I have so much respect for that program, is that within that I see a solution, and maybe in a broader sense, but I think it would have to be scaled up to a much greater degree than it is, at present. But that paradoxically, I think, our weaknesses are potentially our greatest strengths. And as our vulnerabilities are our greatest strength. Because I saw, after the chief spoke, I saw a room full of people, over the course of that week and leaving that class, that any public agency would be proud, serving their citizens. And, for whatever else it accomplished, for me, that's a lesson, that I think we could all learn a lot from.
Yeah, I agree 100%. I've heard a lot of great things about struggle well. A lot of people on here have been through it, and post-traumatic growth is exactly it. And, you listen to people talking about the ACEs, the Adverse Childhood Experience Score, and on average, we're supposed to be 6 out of 10, and incarcerated persons are supposed to be 6 out of 10. So if we can have post-traumatic growth and ultimately become police officers and firefighters and soldiers, especially if we do the work, and now our early life that sent us into uniform becomes an asset, becomes resilience, becomes even more, empathy, then why is the person who found themselves the wrong side of the law not able to do the same thing? So whether it's someone who's struggling in uniform, whether it's someone who's struggling in, behind bars at the moment, if we believe that most of us can grow from this and therefore be stronger. And how many people have we seen that were former gang members? They're out in their own community now, being the voice of change, being the voice of mentorship for these young people, so they don't go down that path. So I think this is exactly it. The post-traumatic growth model needs to be not just in first responder and military conversations, but for all of society.
Now, I can't remember the exact statistic, but the lowest level of recidivism from state prison in California comes from lifers that are released. So arguably they've, committed the worst crimes and received the worst punishments, and yet, they commit crimes at a much lower rate when they're released. It also reminds me of that story in the Struggle Well book by Captain Charlie Plummer, who tells that the lowest level of post-traumatic stress in members of the military are former prisoners of war, which is, on its face, counterintuitive. You would think those who had the worst experience would have the greatest stress, but in fact, their experiences lead them to much greater happiness and stability in their lives once they're, released from, their prison imprisonment. So, and I think there's also a lesson for, civilian prisoners in that same model. But, we're too busy, being angry at them and hating them perpetually because they're evil and they've done all these terrible things, as if, virtually every other person that's not in prison hasn't made some mistake that they, could have been arrested or jailed for sometime in their life.
Absolutely. Let he who is without sin cast the first stone, as they say.
Yep.
All right. Well, I want to be mindful of your time. I'm sure your dog probably needs to pee as well. I've got to get on with some stuff over here too. So if people listening want to learn more about you or want to reach out to you, where are the best places online to do that?
Oh, I guess my email is, I don't mind being contacted.
Okay, I can put your email on the show notes so you don't have to relay it on here. So, brilliant. Well, Tom, I want to thank you so much. It's been, just such an incredible conversation. And watching the documentary right before we sat down, the emotions were still powerful in my mind as well. But to go through such a storied career as far as, the EMT paramedic and then law enforcement, to have that first, shooting that you encountered, and then the diligence of your training, and then leading to, what happened with Jason, and then, the incredible forgiveness story that came from that. It's been absolutely amazing. So I want to thank you so much for being so generous with your time and coming on the Behind the Shield podcast today.
It's my pleasure, James. Thank you for having me.